The air inside the Senate Finance Committee hearing room carried the stale, institutional weight of 1,000 forgotten debates. It was the kind of afternoon that seemed to exist outside of time, a gray, fluorescent-lit limbo where the great machinery of government groaned along on procedural inertia, producing heat and noise but very little of consequence. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and old ambition, a scent that clung to the walls like decades of accumulated disappointment. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana sat at the dais in the unhurried way of a man who has long since made peace with the pace of the United States Senate. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the pale overhead light. His legal pad was covered in his cramped, deliberate handwriting. He was asking a Treasury official about the mechanics of a proposed tax credit structure, his Louisiana drawl turning each question into something that sounded almost leisurely, almost warm, like a conversation on a back porch in July. To the uninformed observer, he looked like a man who was simply passing time. To anyone who had watched him work, they knew better. They knew that the sleepy affect was the disguise, and the razor was always underneath. The gallery was thin that afternoon. A scattering of congressional staffers sat in the back rows with the resigned posture of people waiting for a bus that might never arrive. A small cluster of policy wonks from competing think tanks traded quiet whispers and checked their phones with the practiced discretion of people who have attended too many hearings to still find them interesting. 3 C-SPAN cameras recorded the proceedings with mechanical faithfulness, broadcasting the quiet choreography of governance to an audience of perhaps several hundred people watching from home offices and break rooms across the country. It was, by any measure, an ordinary Tuesday. Then the door opened. It did not open the way doors open in committee rooms, with the careful quietude of the initiated, the practiced shoulder lean of a staffer arriving with documents, the apologetic half-entry of a late witness. It opened the way a door opens when the person behind it has decided, consciously or not, that the opening itself is part of the message. The heavy oak swung back on its hinges with a force that sent a sharp, resonant crack through the low murmur of the room, and for a fraction of a second, every head turned. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked in like the room was already hers. She wore a fitted blazer the color of midnight, her dark hair pulled back in a way that was severe without being harsh, professional without being deferential. Her jaw was set. Her eyes swept the room with the assessing speed of someone doing rapid tactical calculations, and they landed, without hesitation, on Kennedy. She did not look around for a friendly face. She did not check in with a staffer or glance at her phone. She simply walked toward the committee table with the focused, kinetic energy of a weather system that has decided where it is going to make landfall. The staffers in the back stopped their whispers. The policy wonks looked up from their phones. The C-SPAN cameras, which had been tracking the Treasury officials' dry recitation of projected revenue figures, swiveled in unison toward this new center of gravity. In the press section, 3 journalists who had been in various states of somnolence snapped upright, their fingers moving to their keyboards with a sudden, involuntary urgency. Kennedy did not look up from his legal pad immediately. He finished the note he was writing with the slow, deliberate stroke of a man who does not believe in being rushed. Then, and only then, did he remove his glasses, fold them carefully with both hands, and set them on the table before him. He looked at her. His expression was the expression of a professor who has just seen a student burst into the lecture hall 20 minutes late and is now waiting, with patient academic curiosity, to see how they intend to handle themselves. She planted both palms on the edge of the table. She leaned forward. The room contracted. "Senator Kennedy," she said, and her voice carried the controlled tension of a compressed spring, every word measured, every syllable deliberate. "I have been sitting in my office watching this hearing for the past hour, and I have to say, the performance you're putting on for the American people is one of the most dishonest things I have seen in my time in Congress. And I have seen a great deal." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has texture and weight. Kennedy let it breathe. He let it expand and fill the room until it was almost uncomfortable, and then he did something that nobody in that gallery entirely expected. He smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not a contemptuous smile. a slow, measured smile that seemed to arrive from some place of genuine, almost amused appreciation. It was the smile of a man who has been handed exactly what he was waiting for. "Well now," he said, his drawl rolling out like warm water over smooth stones. "I appreciate you coming down, Congresswoman." He gestured without any particular urgency to the chair beside the witness table. "Please, have a seat." She did not sit. She remained standing, which he had expected. The refusal to sit was itself a statement, and he had already accounted for it in whatever quiet internal calculation he had been running since the moment the door swung open. "I don't need a seat," she said. "I need answers. The people of this country deserve to know why you continue to stand in the way of real economic reform, while American families are being crushed under the weight of a system that you and your colleagues have spent decades rigging in favor of the wealthy. While you sit here asking polite questions about tax credits, people in my district are choosing between insulin and groceries. People in your district, Senator, people in Louisiana, are drowning. Not metaphorically, literally, and you are doing nothing." The gallery stirred. Someone near the back of the room made a low sound of approval. A staffer near the door held a phone up, recording. On social media, the first alerts were already beginning to ripple outward, algorithms detecting the sudden spike in activity from accounts connected to the congressional building, flagging it, amplifying it, sending it rolling across the digital landscape like the leading edge of a wave. Kennedy reached down beside his chair. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, the way a man reaches for a cup of coffee. He produced a manila folder, unmarked, and set it on the table in front of him with a quiet, definitive sound. The reporters leaned in. One of the policy wonks in the gallery quietly set his phone to record video. Ocasio-Cortez's eyes dropped to the folder for exactly 1/2 second, and in that half second, something moved behind them, some flicker of internal recalibration, before the blazing certainty reasserted itself. "Congresswoman," Kennedy said, and his voice had shifted now, dropping from its conversational register into something lower and more deliberate, something that carried the quality of a room going very quiet before a significant thing is said. "I am glad you came. I genuinely am, because the timing is, I think you'll agree, instructive." He opened the folder. He placed one hand flat on the papers inside. "You came in here today to talk about economic justice. You came to talk about who is really serving the people of this country and who is merely performing that service." He looked up at her. "I think that is a conversation worth having. I think it is, in fact, one of the most important conversations we could possibly have. So let's have it. But let's have it honestly. Let's have it with all of the evidence on the table." He clicked a small remote that had been sitting, unnoticed, beside his water glass. The large monitor behind the committee dais flickered to life. "Smash that like button and subscribe, because what is about to happen in this room is something that Washington has spent a very long time hoping you would never see." The first image that appeared on the screen was one that had been seen by millions of people. It was a photograph taken at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, at the annual gala that functions as both a celebration of fashion and a demonstration of the extraordinary distance between the world of the very wealthy and the world of everyone else. In the photograph, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood in a white gown of considerable artistry, her back to the camera in a pose that had been carefully composed or expertly seized upon, because the phrase written across the fabric in bold red letters was perfectly, devastatingly legible: "Tax the rich." The image had ricocheted around the world when it was first published. It had been celebrated and condemned, analyzed and satirized. It had been a moment of what her supporters described as radical authenticity, a politician willing to carry her convictions into the most rarefied rooms in America, to speak truth to power in the language of power itself. It had made her, in the eyes of millions, even more than she already was. Kennedy looked at the image for a moment. Then he looked at her. Then he looked back at the room. He did this with the patience of someone who understands that the pause itself is doing work. "September 13th, 2021, he said. "The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Met Gala." He clicked the remote and the photograph remained, but beside it a new set of information materialized on screen, formatted with the clinical precision of a legal document. A single ticket to the Met Gala in that year carried a face value of approximately $30,000. You did not purchase a ticket, Congresswoman. You attended as a guest of a designer house, which is not, on its own, unusual in the world of politics and culture. What is unusual is what followed. He moved to the next slide. The room was absolutely still. Outside in the hallway, someone walked past the closed door. The sound of their footsteps briefly intruded and then was gone. The dress you wore that evening was a custom-designed piece, the creation of a designer whose work does not come cheaply and whose invoicing is, as we will see, a matter of some documented history. You also received the services of a professional hairstylist, a professional makeup artist, a luxury car service, preparation accommodations in a premium hotel suite, and borrowed jewelry of considerable value. Your partner received a tuxedo, also provided. These are not small gifts, Congresswoman. By the time you add them together, we are talking about a total package of goods and services whose combined value runs well into the tens of thousands of dollars. Ocasio-Cortez had crossed her arms. The gesture was controlled, but it was there, and the cameras caught it, and the people watching the live stream on their phones saw it. And in the comment sections beneath those streams, the observations were already beginning to pile up. She said nothing. She was waiting, and behind the waiting was something that looked, to a careful observer, like the beginning of a calculation. She was running through the possible responses. She was weighing them against each other. She had not yet found the right one. Kennedy continued. In September of 2021, following the event, invoices were submitted by several of the vendors who had provided those goods and services. These vendors were not large corporations with accounting departments and legal teams, and the financial cushion to absorb a delayed payment without consequence. They were small business owners. They were independent artisans. They were, to use a phrase you yourself have employed with some frequency, working people. And for them, the question of when they would be paid was not an abstract accounting matter. It was a matter of whether they could make rent. He clicked the remote again. A timeline appeared on the screen, its entries spaced along a horizontal axis that stretched from September of 2021 forward through the following year. Each entry was a date. Each date was accompanied by a brief notation. The room watched the timeline populate itself with the quiet dread of people watching evidence accumulate. September 13th, Kennedy said. The event. Invoices submitted in the weeks following. October passes. November passes. December arrives and the bills remain outstanding. January of 2022. February of 2022. He paused after each month, letting the weight of the elapsed time settle over the room. In February of 2022, a complaint is filed with the House Ethics Committee by the American Accountability Foundation. The complaint alleges that the goods and services you received at the gala may constitute impermissible gifts under House rules, gifts that were not properly disclosed and not properly valued. 2 days after that complaint is filed, one of the outstanding invoices is paid. 2 days, Congresswoman. He let that land. 2 days after an official investigation is opened. Suddenly, the administrative machinery that had been too slow to process these payments for 5 months finds a way to move rather quickly. In March, another payment arrives. A vendor who had been waiting since September receives what is owed. In May of 2022, more than 8 months after the event, additional payments are made, but not all, not the full amounts. And the Ethics Committee, as it reviews the matter, makes certain findings that I would like to share with the room today. He reached beside his chair and produced a bound document, its cover bearing an official seal. This is the report from the House Ethics Committee, he said. It is a bipartisan document. It was produced not by Republican operatives or political adversaries, but by a committee composed of members of both parties, operating under the procedural obligations of the House of Representatives. I will read from the relevant section. He opened to a marked page. The committee finds that the representatives' failure to ensure timely payment for goods and services received in connection with the September 2021 event constituted a violation of House ethics rules. The committee further finds that the pattern of payment, in which multiple vendors received remuneration only following the initiation of a formal inquiry, creates an appearance that the goods and services in question may have been received as gifts, in violation of the gift rule applicable to all members of the House of Representatives. He closed the document and set it on the table. He did not slam it. He did not drop it with theatrical emphasis. He simply set it down, quietly, in the manner of someone who understands that the document speaks for itself and requires no theatrical assistance. An appearance of gifts. That is the language of a bipartisan ethics committee, not the language of a political opponent, not the language of a conservative commentator or a rival campaign, the language of the institution you serve. Ocasio-Cortez uncrossed her arms. She placed one hand on the table. There were procedural issues with my office's payment processes, she said, and her voice was steady but had lost its opening velocity, its prosecutorial confidence. Those issues were addressed. The payments were made. The Ethics Committee did not recommend any punitive action against me personally, and I think it is important for this room to understand the context in which these things are being presented, which is a deeply partisan one. Kennedy tilted his head just slightly as if considering something mildly interesting. He did not raise his voice. "I appreciate the context," he said. "Let me offer a bit more of it." He clicked the remote again. A photograph appeared on the screen. It showed a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, standing in front of a small salon. The salon had a hand-painted sign above the door and a window display that showed obvious care and personal investment, the kind of attention to detail that belongs to someone who has put everything they have into a thing and wants the world to see it properly. The young woman in the photograph was smiling, but the smile had in it the particular quality of someone who has worked very hard and is allowing themselves, just this once, the small luxury of being proud. "Her name is Deja Williams," Kennedy said. "She is a hair stylist. She owns this salon in Brooklyn, which she built after 7 years of working as a stylist in other people's shops, saving every dollar she could, living with 2 roommates in a 1-bedroom apartment until she had enough to sign a lease on her own space. She has a daughter. She is not married. She is the kind of person whose story you have told in campaign speeches and fundraising emails and floor speeches in the House of Representatives. She is, by your own articulation, the person you are fighting for." The room was completely still. Somewhere outside the building, a car horn sounded, muffled by the walls, an intrusion from the real city that existed beyond this chamber. In September of 2021, Deja Williams received a call inviting her to provide hair services for a member of Congress attending the Metropolitan Museum Gala. She told the investigator who spoke with her that she stayed up until 2 in the morning the night before, practicing. She said she had never worked an event of that magnitude and she wanted to be perfect. She brought her best tools. She worked for 4 hours. She submitted her invoice the following week for $480. $480. He let that number sit in the air for a moment. That was her rate. That was what 4 hours of her skill, her expertise, her artistry was worth. And she asked for what was fair, and she submitted the paperwork, and she waited. He clicked to the next slide. A series of document images appeared, screenshots of emails and text messages, each one showing a date and a polite, then less polite, then quietly desperate inquiry about payment. October, he said. She follows up by email. November, she sends a text. December, she calls the office and leaves a voicemail. January, another email. February, another text, this one containing a sentence that the investigator who reviewed it described as heartbreaking. She writes, "I'm not sure how to follow up again without seeming difficult, but I am struggling to cover my supply expenses this month and I was counting on this payment." He paused. He did not editorialize. He simply allowed the sentence to exist in the room. She was counting on it, he said. $480. Less than 3/1000ths of your annual congressional salary, Congresswoman, and she was counting on it. She had scheduled her expenses around receiving it. She had told herself it was coming, and it did not come. For 5 months it did not come. Not until the Ethics Committee investigation was opened. And then, within the week, it arrived. Ocasio-Cortez's jaw was tight. "I was not personally aware of the delay with individual vendor payments," she said. That is a function of my staff's administrative operations, and when the issue was brought to my attention, it was corrected. Kennedy nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is choosing his words with exceptional care. You are not personally aware, he repeated. That is, I think, a phrase worth examining. Because in every speech you have given about corporate accountability, in every floor statement about the responsibility of executives and employers and people in positions of power, the argument you make, and it is a good argument, is that the person at the top bears ultimate responsibility for what happens in the organization they lead. That accountability does not diffuse upward from the staff level. It flows downward from the top. He looked at her steadily. Is that not the standard you have advocated? Is that not the argument you make when you are speaking about a CEO who claims they were unaware of conditions in their supply chain? The standard you apply to others, Congresswoman. Does it apply to you? She opened her mouth. She closed it. In the press section, a reporter who had been typing without pause for the last 10 minutes stopped, looked up, and in that unguarded moment, her expression was one of someone watching something they will write about for a long time. But there is something larger here, Kennedy continued, and his voice shifted slightly again, moving from the prosecutorial into something that carried the quality of genuine, sober concern. Something that goes beyond the specific question of administrative oversight and payment timelines. He reached into the folder and produced another document. The room waited. Because while the Met Gala situation tells us something about the gap between what you say and what you do in your personal conduct, there is a decision you made, Congresswoman, that did not affect one hair stylist. That did not affect one makeup artist. That decision affected tens of thousands of families. It affected a city. And I think the people in this room, and the people watching at home, deserve to hear it told honestly and in full. He opened the second document. The monitor behind him shifted. Let's talk about Amazon. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. The staffers in the back exchanged glances. One of the policy wonks set her notepad down on her knee and leaned forward. The C-SPAN cameras adjusted their framing slightly, instinctively, the way cameras do when they sense something is about to happen that requires a wider shot. On the monitor behind Kennedy, a map of New York City appeared, with a specific area of Queens highlighted. Beside the map, a figure materialized in large text, 25,000 to 40,000 jobs. November of 2018, Kennedy said, Amazon, the largest e-commerce company in the world, following a nationwide search that lasted over a year and involved 238 competing cities, announces that it has selected 2 locations for its second headquarters. One of them is Arlington, Virginia. The other is Long Island City, in the borough of Queens, in the congressional district represented by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He let that detail sit for a moment. In your district, Congresswoman, the company that was going to bring tens of thousands of high-paying jobs was going to bring them to the people you were elected to serve. He advanced the slide. The images were architectural renderings, sweeping and glass-filled, a campus designed to be permanent and transformative, the kind of infrastructure that cities compete for because they understand that what it represents is not just jobs but decades of economic velocity, tax revenue, restaurant business, small business growth, young professionals with disposable income, all the ancillary and secondary and tertiary economic effects that flow from a major employer taking root in a community and building. The projected average salary for Amazon positions at this campus was in excess of $150,000 per year. He paused to let that number register. $150,000. These are not minimum wage positions. These are careers. These are the kinds of jobs that allow a family to buy a home, to build savings, to send children to college without debt, to exist in one of the most expensive cities in the world with something approaching financial security. The company committed to a minimum of 25,000 jobs over the first decade, with the possibility of growth to 40,000. Economists at multiple institutions projected that the ripple effects of those direct jobs would generate an additional 15,000 or more indirect positions across the borough and the surrounding area. Small businesses, service providers. the entire ecosystem of economic activity that grows up around a major employer. He walked to the whiteboard. He picked up a marker and wrote a number, 40,000. He underlined it once, 40,000 jobs. He wrote a second number below it, 150,000, average salary. He stepped back and looked at what he had written. Now, he said, turning to face the room, the deal that New York City struck with Amazon included a performance-based incentive package that was publicly described and politically attacked as a giveaway of $3 billion in taxpayer money to a corporation whose founder was, at the time, the wealthiest individual on the planet. And that framing, that characterization of the deal as a $3 billion gift to a billionaire, became the rallying cry of the opposition. It became the central argument in a campaign against the project. And that campaign was led, with extraordinary effectiveness, by the congresswoman now standing in this room. He paused. He set the marker down. He walked back to the table and looked at her directly. So let's examine that claim. Let's look at what the $3 billion actually was. Because if you are going to stake your political identity on fighting for economic truth and against misleading narratives that harm working people, then this particular narrative deserves scrutiny. He clicked the remote. A diagram appeared on screen showing the structure of a performance-based tax credit. The graphics were simple and clear, designed for comprehension rather than complexity. The $3 billion was not a check, he said. It was not cash. It was not a wire transfer. It was not money that existed anywhere that had been collected by the city, that was sitting in an account waiting to be distributed. It was a tax abatement, a conditional reduction in future taxes, applicable only if and only after Amazon had created the jobs and generated the economic activity that would, in turn, produce new tax revenue for the city of New York. He moved to the whiteboard again and wrote a simple equation. Revenue generated by 40,000 jobs at $150,000 average salary, taxed at the applicable city and state rates, was projected to produce approximately $27 billion in new tax receipts over the first decade. The city agreed to retain 24 of those $27 billion, while allowing Amazon to retain $3 billion as a performance-based incentive. He wrote the numbers on the board: $27 billion, $3 billion discount, $24 billion retained. He turned to face the room. The narrative that was sold to the residents of Queens and New York City, the narrative that was amplified from political rallies and social media accounts and cable news hits, was that the city was giving Amazon $3 billion. He drew a circle around the number 3. The reality is that the city was offered $24 billion in new revenue it would never otherwise have had. He drew a circle around 24. You did not save New York City $3 billion, Congresswoman. You cost it $24 billion. And you cost it 40,000 jobs, and you stood on a stage and called that a victory. Ocasio-Cortez stepped forward. Her voice had sharpened. That framing deliberately ignores the substance of the community opposition. She said, the people of Long Island City did not want their neighborhood handed over to a union-busting corporation without community input, without guarantees of affordable housing, without assurance that working-class families who had built that community would not be priced out by the development. This was about community power and community voice, not about abstract economic projections from economists who do not live in my district. Kennedy nodded. He did not dismiss this. I will come to the community concerns, he said. They deserve to be addressed honestly. But before I do, I want to introduce someone to this room. He gestured toward the gallery. He looked at a woman in the third row who had been sitting with her hands folded in her lap since before the hearing began. She had the posture of someone who has rehearsed for something and is now waiting for the moment that rehearsal was meant to prepare her for. The woman stood. She was in her early 40s, wearing a dark blazer and a careful expression. Her name, she said, was Carmen Reyes. She lived in Astoria, Queens, which bordered the Long Island City neighborhood where the Amazon campus was planned. She worked 2 jobs, she said. Mornings as a home health aide for an elderly woman in Flushing, evenings at a dry cleaning establishment 3 blocks from her apartment. She had done this for 9 years. She had 2 children. Her son was 12. Her daughter was 16 and wanted to study biomedical engineering. My daughter, Carmen Reyes said, is the smartest person I know. I'm not saying that because I am her mother. I am saying it because her teachers have told me. Because she tested into the specialized science program at her high school. Because she spends her evenings reading about cell biology and watching lectures from university professors on her phone. She wants to go to college. She wants to study something that requires an expensive degree. And I have been terrified for her entire childhood of what that is going to look like, what it is going to cost, whether I will ever be able to give her what she needs to get there. The room was very quiet. Kennedy stood with his hands at his sides, not moving, not prompting, giving Carmen Reyes the space to say what she had come to say. When I heard Amazon was coming to Long Island City, she continued, I didn't understand all the economics. I'm not an economist, but I understood jobs. I understood that a company that size coming into the neighborhood was going to need workers at every level. Administrative staff, logistics, technical support, facilities management. Jobs that pay well. Jobs with health insurance. Jobs that a person can build a life around. I went to a community information session at the library. I signed up for the job training program that the city was already developing in anticipation of the campus opening. I spent 4 months in the evenings, after my shifts, taking coursework online to qualify for a logistics coordinator position. I was enrolled. I was scheduled. I had a conditional acceptance in a hiring pipeline that was waiting for the campus to be approved and the ground to be broken. She paused. She looked at Ocasio-Cortez. The congresswoman met her gaze but did not speak. When the deal fell apart, Carmen said, I lost something that I will never be able to fully explain to anyone who did not experience it. I do not mean I lost a job. I mean I lost a version of my future that I had, for the first time in my adult life, allowed myself to believe in. I had told my daughter that things were going to be different. I had told her that. I had let her believe it. Her voice caught. She steadied herself with a breath. I am still working 2 jobs. I am still terrified about my daughter's tuition. And the woman who took that future away from me, she looked up and her gaze was not angry. It was something harder and more permanent than anger. It was clarity, stood on television and celebrated. She sat down. The silence that followed had the quality of something that has been broken and cannot be repaired. Kennedy stood for a long moment. He looked at the table. He looked at the folder. He did not look at Ocasio-Cortez, and the deliberateness of that choice was itself a statement. The decision to let Carmen Reyes' testimony be the thing the room held without rushing to the next point. Then he spoke again, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and more serious. You said the opposition was about community voice, he said. It is true that there were community voices opposed to the project. There were also community voices in favor. There were union workers who supported it and union workers who opposed it. There were small business owners on both sides. There were housing advocates who argued it would accelerate gentrification and housing advocates who argued that the tax revenue it generated would fund the affordable housing investments the city desperately needed. This was a complex, contested civic question, and the people of Long Island City and Queens had legitimate and varied views on it. He paused. What is not true, he said, is that the community process was denied. What is not true is that the voices of working-class residents like Carmen Reyes, who wanted those jobs, who needed that economic opportunity, who had structured their lives and their hopes around the possibility that it represented, were taken seriously in the decision that was ultimately made. The campaign against Amazon was not run from within the community. It was run from social media and cable news. It was run from the architecture of political performance. And when the campaign succeeded, when Amazon withdrew and the project collapsed, the people who bore the cost were not the progressive activists who claimed the victory. The people who bore the cost were Carmen Reyes and the hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers like her, people who were never asked, never consulted, never told that someone was about to decide on their behalf, that they did not need the opportunity that was being offered. He picked up the remote again. On the screen behind him, a split image appeared. On the left, a photograph of the Amazon HQ2 campus in Arlington, Virginia, sleek and enormous and complete, surrounded by a neighborhood that had transformed visibly, restaurants and shops and apartment buildings, and the entire economic ecosystem of a city that had said yes when New York City said no. On the right, a photograph of the Long Island City waterfront where the campus was planned. The contrast required no narration. The jobs went to Virginia, Kennedy said. The tax revenue went to Virginia. The economic velocity went to Virginia. The economic future that should have belonged to your constituents, Congresswoman, the future that Carmen Reyes had enrolled herself in vocational training to access, went to Virginia. And your district got empty permits and a political talking point. He closed the second folder. He reached for the third, which was thicker than the others and carried with it, when he set it on the table, a percussive weight that seemed to send a small vibration through the silence. But I want to be fair, he said. The Amazon decision was about a specific project in a specific community. The consequences were enormous and real, but they were local. Your signature policy proposal, the one you have made the centerpiece of your political identity and your legislative ambition, if implemented as written, would not affect one community. It would not affect one city or one region. It would reshape the entire American economy. And the people who would pay the price would not be the people who could most easily absorb it. He opened the folder. Let's talk about the Green New Deal. The monitor shifted again. The document that appeared on screen was the House resolution as introduced, its text familiar to anyone who had followed the policy debate of the past several years. Ambitious in scope, sweeping in aspiration, built on the premise that the crisis of climate change demanded a response not merely of regulatory adjustment, but of fundamental economic transformation. Kennedy read the headline goals aloud with the careful, neutral delivery of a man presenting evidence rather than argument. Net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a 10-year national mobilization. 100% of the power demand of the United States met through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources. Upgrading every residential and industrial and commercial building in the country for maximum energy efficiency. Eliminating pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from all manufacturing and all agriculture. Overhauling the national transportation system to eliminate reliance on fossil fuels. A federal jobs guarantee providing all workers with family-sustaining wages, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacations, and retirement security. He paused at this one. A universal basic income, access to nature, clean air and water, healthy food, and a sustainable environment. He set the document down. This is, he said, a comprehensive restructuring of the American economy and the American social contract, not an amendment to existing energy policy, not an incremental shift in regulatory frameworks, a complete reconstitution of how Americans produce and consume energy, how they work, what they earn, what their relationship to the federal government looks like. It is the most ambitious domestic policy proposal in the history of the Republic. Ocasio-Cortez had moved to a chair at the witness table. She sat with the controlled stillness of someone who has decided that movement would be read as defensiveness. The plan is an investment, she said. The cost of inaction on climate change dwarfs any projected cost of action. The science is unambiguous. The economic modeling used by opponents of this legislation consistently discounts the catastrophic economic consequences of continued carbon emissions. And it is those consequences that represent the true fiscal threat to the American economy. Kennedy nodded again. He was beginning to seem like someone who nods not because he agrees, but because he is recording what is being said and filing it precisely. The investment argument, he said. Let's follow that argument to where it leads. He walked to the whiteboard. What is the size of the investment? He wrote a range across the board. The estimates produced by independent economic modeling organizations, using standard macroeconomic projection tools, placed the 10-year cost of implementing the Green New Deal between $51 and $93 trillion. He wrote both numbers, circling them. At the low end, that is roughly equal to the entire projected federal revenue of the United States for a decade. At the high end, it exceeds the projected gross domestic product of the country. He turned to face the room. For context, he said, the entire federal budget of the United States, everything we spend on the military, on Social Security, on Medicare and Medicaid, on roads and schools and federal law enforcement, on every program and agency and obligation of the federal government, is approximately $6 trillion per year. The low-end estimate of the Green New Deal would require spending on top of the existing federal budget an amount equal to the entire existing federal budget every year for 10 years. He wrote the calculation on the board. It is the equivalent of a family earning $60,000 per year announcing a plan to spend an additional $60,000 per year, not from savings, not from income, from borrowing, every year for a decade. He paused. He set the marker down. But the investment argument requires a return, he said. So let's ask the most important question about any investment. What do we get? What is the return? He clicked the remote. A new slide appeared, and on it was a number so small in its implications that it seemed almost improbable, a number that required a moment of processing before its full meaning landed. 0.15 degrees Celsius. That, Kennedy said, is the projected impact on global average temperatures by the year 2100 if the United States were to achieve complete elimination of its carbon emissions tomorrow. Not gradual reduction. Complete elimination. Zero emissions, beginning immediately. The return on the investment of transforming the entire American economy and spending between $51 and $93 trillion would be, according to the climate modeling cited by the National Center for Atmospheric Research, a reduction in projected global temperatures of approximately 1/10 degree Celsius by the end of the century. The room absorbed this. Ocasio-Cortez was leaning forward, and her expression had shifted from controlled to something more complicated, the expression of someone who has heard this argument before and is assembling the counterargument. But who is, in this particular moment, in this particular room, with this particular audience, finding the assembly slower than usual? This is because the United States, while historically the largest cumulative emitter of carbon, currently accounts for approximately 14% of global annual emissions. Kennedy continued. China accounts for approximately 30%. India's emissions are growing rapidly. Together, the developing economies of Asia and Africa are projected to increase global emissions substantially over the coming decades regardless of what the United States does. The climate system does not respond to national borders. It responds to total atmospheric concentration. American unilateral decarbonization, however complete, however costly, would address less than 15% of the global emissions that are driving the temperature increases we are trying to prevent. He let this sit. Then he said something quieter. I am not making the argument that climate change is not real. I am not making the argument that reducing carbon emissions is not a legitimate policy goal. I am making the argument that a policy intervention that costs between $50 and $90 trillion and produces a measurable impact of 1/10 of a degree is not an investment. It is not a solution. It is the most expensive way ever conceived by human beings to fail at solving a problem. He reached for another document from within the folder. And the costs are not theoretical, he said. Let me tell you about the costs that are very specific and very human. He clicked the remote. On the screen, a photograph appeared. A man in his 50s, weathered and broad-shouldered, standing on the deck of an offshore platform with the Gulf of Mexico visible behind him, the blue-green water, and the enormous industrial structure of the rig forming a backdrop that was simultaneously beautiful and alien. This is Raymond Thibodeaux, Kennedy said. He is 53 years old. He is from Yuma, Louisiana, which is in my state. He has worked on offshore oil platforms for 28 years. He does not have a college degree. He has a high school diploma, a commercial diving certification, and 28 years of experience operating heavy industrial equipment in one of the most physically demanding and technically complex work environments on the planet. He earns $94,000 per year. He has 3 children. His youngest just started college at Louisiana State University. His wife teaches 4th grade in Terrebonne Parish. Kennedy paused. He looked at the photograph. Raymond Thibodeaux is not a villain of the climate story. He is a man who, over 28 years, developed a set of skills that are genuinely valuable and genuinely specialized, and he built a life around those skills, and his family built their security around that life, and his son's college tuition is being paid by the wages produced by those skills. And the Green New Deal, as written, calls for the elimination of the fossil fuel industry within a decade. He looked at Ocasio-Cortez. Not a transition, he said. The resolution you introduced uses the language of a just transition for workers, but the mechanisms for achieving that transition are undefined, unfunded, and premised on the existence of replacement employment opportunities in clean energy sectors that do not currently exist at the necessary scale and may not exist at that scale within the timeframe the plan specifies. Raymond Thibodeaux cannot retrain for a job that does not yet exist. He cannot relocate his family to a solar panel manufacturing plant that has not been built. He cannot sustain his son's college tuition on the promise of a transition that is a political aspiration rather than a concrete economic plan. He clicked to the next image. A map of the United States appeared, with states highlighted in varying intensities based on their fossil fuel employment. Louisiana, Texas, Wyoming, West Virginia, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma. The darker the color, the higher the concentration of jobs in industries that the Green New Deal would eliminate. In Louisiana alone, he said, the oil and gas industry directly employs 250,000 people. The average wage in that sector is significantly above the state median. These are not executives. These are engineers, welders, pipe fitters, electricians, offshore workers, refinery operators, truck drivers, equipment specialists. People with high school diplomas and trade certifications who are earning wages that allow them to participate in the middle class. Their jobs under your plan are gone. Their industries are eliminated. And the plan for what happens to them is, in the most generous reading of the text, aspirational. Ocasio-Cortez was on her feet again. She had been still for longer than she was comfortable with, and the stillness had done its work, and now she needed to move. These arguments, she said, and her voice had recovered something of its original sharpness, are the same arguments that were made against the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the regulations that ended acid rain and the phase-out of leaded gasoline. Every meaningful environmental protection in American history was opposed using the same economic arguments you are making right now. The same warnings about job losses, about industrial disruption, about costs too large to bear. And in every case, the economy adapted. In every case, the transition was managed. In every case, the predictions of catastrophe were wrong. Kennedy considered this. He did not rush his response. You are citing the transition from leaded to unleaded gasoline, he said finally, as a model for the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. He paused. The scale of those two things is not comparable. Removing lead from gasoline required a formulation change in the refining process and a modification of engine designs. It did not require the elimination of the automotive industry, or the closure of refineries, or the displacement of the workforce of an entire sector of the American economy. The transitions you cite were, in most cases, incremental adaptations within existing industrial frameworks. What you are proposing is the elimination of the framework itself. He paused again. I want to ask you something, Congresswoman. He looked at her steadily, and his voice had the quality now of someone who is genuinely asking rather than rhetorically maneuvering. Do you believe that China will implement a comparable decarbonization program on a comparable timeline? Do you believe that India will? Do you believe that Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, all of the developing nations whose emissions are projected to grow substantially over the coming decades as their populations urbanize and industrialize? Do you believe they will accept the economic constraints you are proposing to impose on the United States? She did not answer immediately. The silence stretched for 2 seconds, 3, long enough to be heard. Because if they will not, he continued, then the jobs that leave American manufacturing, driven out by the energy cost increases that inevitably accompany the rapid elimination of fossil fuels, do not disappear. They relocate. They go to countries with lower energy costs, countries that are powering their factories with coal, countries whose environmental standards are considerably lower than ours. Your plan would have the measurable effect of transferring American industrial employment to higher emission jurisdictions, thereby increasing global carbon output while simultaneously devastating American manufacturing communities. It would be a policy that achieves the opposite of its stated environmental goal while producing guaranteed economic damage at home. He closed the third folder. There was a fourth one beneath it, thinner than the others, and when he reached for it, the motion seemed almost reluctant, the gesture of someone who has been thorough and comprehensive and honest and now must do one more thing that he would, if he could, prefer not to do. He set the thin folder on the table. He did not open it immediately. He looked at it for a moment, and his expression in that moment was not the expression of a man with an argument to win. It was the expression of a man about to say something that he finds genuinely sad. The things we have talked about today, he said quietly, the Met Gala, the Amazon decision, the Green New Deal, these are important. They are matters of public record and public consequence, and they deserve scrutiny. But there is one more thing. He placed his hand on the folder, and this one is harder to talk about because it is not about a policy position or a legislative vote or an institutional decision. This is about something smaller and more personal and, I think, more revealing than anything else we have discussed. This is about your grandmother. The word landed in the room and changed everything. There was a shift, almost physical, in the quality of the air, a sense of some invisible register being crossed, of the conversation moving from the macro to the micro, from the institutional to the intimate. Several people in the gallery exchanged glances. One of the reporters stopped typing and simply watched. Kennedy opened the folder. He produced a single printed page, a screenshot of a social media post. He did not click the remote this time. He held it in his hands and read it. This, he said, is a post from your verified account on social media, published on June 2nd, 2021. You wrote, and I am reading your own words, "Just over a week ago, my abuela fell ill. I went to Puerto Rico to see her and she showed me her home. This is what it looked like." He paused, then continued. Hurricane Maria relief has still not reached her or many others in Puerto Rico. Trump has blocked relief money for Puerto Rico. People are being forced to flee ancestral homes we've been in for centuries. He looked up. Attached to the post was a photograph of your grandmother's home. The image showed a room with a ceiling that had partially collapsed. There was visible water damage. There was debris on the floor. There was a bucket positioned to catch rain that came in through the damaged roof. It was the photograph of a home in a state of significant disrepair, and it was posted not as a private communication to family or friends, but as a public document, shared with your millions of followers, accompanied by a political argument about government negligence and the failures of a former president. He set the page down. "I want to be very precise about the timeline here," he said, "because the timeline is important and it is not in dispute. Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico in September of 2017. Your grandmother's home was damaged in that storm. At the time of the storm, you were working as a bartender in New York City. You had limited financial means. That is not a criticism. That is simply a fact, and it is a fact that carries with it obvious and understandable limitations on what you could do." He clicked the remote now, and the timeline appeared on screen, stark and linear and absolutely factual. "November 2018, he said. You are elected to the United States Congress. You take office in January of 2019. Your congressional salary is $174,000 per year. You are now, from the moment you take office, in the top 5% of individual income earners in the United States. You are earning a salary that the vast majority of Americans, including the vast majority of your constituents, will never earn. You are no longer a person of limited financial means. You are a person of significant financial means by the standards of any honest accounting." Click 2019. Your grandmother's home remains in the condition documented in that later photograph. The roof is damaged. The ceiling is compromised. The water damage is present. Click 2020. Your grandmother's home remains in that condition. You are now in your second year as a member of Congress, drawing your full congressional salary. Click 2021. Your grandmother's home remains in that condition. In June of 2021, you visit her. You see the state of her home, and the decision you make in that moment is to take a photograph and post it on the internet. He let that sentence finish, and then he let it breathe in the room for a long moment. He continued, "The cost of repairing a damaged roof in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria was widely documented. The average cost, according to multiple housing recovery organizations that operated on the island following the storm, ranged between $8,000 and $15,000, depending on the scope of the damage. That is, at the low end, less than 1 month's salary on your congressional pay scale. At the high end, it is approximately 1 month's salary." He paused. "You had been earning that salary for 2.5 years. At the time you posted that photograph." Ocasio-Cortez stood. Her voice, when it came, was different from anything she had used in this room before. It was not the sharp prosecutorial voice of her entrance. It was not the controlled, defensive register of her responses to the earlier material. It was something rawer and more personal, and underneath that, more dangerous. "My grandmother's situation," she said, "is not a political prop for you to use in this room. It is a personal family matter. And I find it deeply disturbing and frankly disgusting that you would reach into the private life of an elderly woman to score political points." Kennedy did not raise his voice to meet hers. He did not match her register. He remained in his quiet, deliberate cadence, which was its own kind of answer. "You made it public," he said. "Not I. You were the one who posted the photograph. You were the one who shared the image of her damaged home with millions of people. You were the one who used her suffering as evidence in a political argument about your opponents. I am not the one who introduced your grandmother's situation to the public record. You are." He paused. "And because you chose to make it public, and because you chose to use it as the basis for a political argument, I think the public has a legitimate interest in the full context of that situation, including the context that was not present in your post, including the question of what you, as a person earning $174,000 a year, could have done and chose not to do." He picked up the remote again. "Something happened after you posted that photograph," he said. "Something that I think tells us something important. Not about your political opponents, not about the failures of federal disaster relief, about the American people themselves." He clicked, and on the screen appeared a screenshot of a crowdfunding campaign page. The title read, "Help Abuela. Let's get AOC's grandmother's home repaired." The thumbnail image below the title was the same photograph Ocasio-Cortez had posted. The description explained that people who had seen the post were moved by the image of an elderly woman living in a damaged home and wanted to help. "Within 48 hours of your post," Kennedy said, "private citizens had contributed over $100,000 to this campaign." He clicked through screenshots showing the funding total at various intervals, the number climbing with the gathered momentum of ordinary decency. $100,000. From strangers. From people across the country who saw a photograph of an old woman's damaged ceiling and decided to do something about it. He clicked to a breakdown of the donations. The average contribution was approximately $27. The largest single donation was $500. Most were 10, 15, 25. These are not wealthy donors. These are not political operatives or special interests. These are people who gave what they could because they were moved by a story about an elderly woman in need." He paused. He looked at her. He spoke very quietly. "And your response to this extraordinary outpouring of human generosity was to refuse it. Your office released a statement declining the funds, describing the campaign as a right-wing attack stunt." He let those words sit in the room. $100,000 from ordinary Americans. Enough to repair the roof several times over. Enough to fix everything in that house and leave a substantial surplus. And the person who had posted the photograph of the damaged home, the person who had invited the world to witness her grandmother's situation, rejected the help because it came from people she had decided were her political enemies. Because accepting it would have required her to acknowledge that the people she routinely describes as her opponents are capable of compassion. Because the narrative of the victimized grandmother, suffering in a damaged house because of the failures of political opponents, required the grandmother to remain in the damaged house. He walked back to his chair. He sat down slowly. He picked up the thin folder and closed it and set it aside. He folded his hands on the table, and he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "You walked into this room today," he said, "and called me a hypocrite. You accused me of talking out of both sides of my mouth, of saying one thing and doing another, of pretending to serve the people while actually serving the powerful. Those are serious charges, and I have spent the last several hours asking whether those charges can be substantiated against you, whether there is evidence in your own record, your own choices, your own publicly documented decisions, that bears on the question of whether your words and your actions are consistent with each other." He reached forward and arranged the 4 folders in a line on the table before him. He looked at the line they made: the Met Gala, Amazon, the Green New Deal, your grandmother. He looked up. "Here is what those 4 things have in common," he said. "Each of them represents a moment when you had a choice. In each case, the choice that would have been consistent with the things you say, with the values you profess, with the identity you have constructed in public, would have been a harder choice, a costlier choice, a less visible choice. Paying the vendors promptly and in full without waiting for an investigation to force the issue. Engaging with the Amazon decision in a way that genuinely grappled with the needs of the workers and families who wanted those jobs, rather than treating their hopes as collateral damage in a social media campaign. Acknowledging the genuine complexities of climate policy, rather than proposing something whose costs are certain and whose benefits are minimal. Quietly, privately, with your own money, repairing your grandmother's roof. And in each case, you made the other choice. The choice that served your image, the choice that produced content, the choice that generated applause and outrage and clicks, the choice that built the brand, even when it cost the people you claim to be serving something real and lasting and irreplaceable." He paused. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. He was not angry. The anger, if it had ever been there, had been consumed by something heavier and more durable, something that looked in this moment like a genuine and unsentimental grief. "There is something genuinely sad about this," he said, and his voice was low and without performance, "because the talent is real. The energy is real. The connection to young people and to a generation that has legitimate grievances with the systems they inherited, that is real. You could have been, you could still be, genuinely transformative. You have the platform. You have the visibility. You have the ability to make people feel seen and heard in a way that most politicians in this building cannot approximate. But transformation requires consistency. It requires that the private choices align with the public rhetoric. It requires that the people you are fighting for trust that, when there is a cost to pay, you will pay it. That you will not ask them to make the sacrifice while you preserve your own comfort. That you will not use their suffering as the content for your career." He looked at the folders. He looked at her. He looked at the room. And the room looked back at him in a silence that had the quality of something settled, something that had found its final form. Carmen Reyes was on her feet again in the gallery. She was not loud. She did not need to be. She said, in the voice of someone who has nothing left to lose and nothing more to prove, "I trained for 4 months. I told my daughter things were going to change." She paused. "I was wrong." And then she sat back down, and the weight of those 3 sentences occupied the silence that followed them with an authority that no rhetorical construction could have matched. In the press section, a journalist had stopped typing. She was staring at the table in front of her with the expression of someone assembling, in real time, the structure of the story she is going to write. The story was already there. It had been building for 3 hours. It had the architecture of something that would outlast the afternoon. Kennedy reached for his water glass and took a slow, deliberate drink. He set the glass down with the same care with which he set everything down, the care of someone who understands that the smallest gestures are watched and interpreted in rooms like this one. He looked at his papers. He straightened them. He was, in every visible way, finished. Ocasio-Cortez stood at the witness table. The blazer that had looked so precise and deliberate when she walked in 3 hours ago was slightly altered now, not disheveled, not broken, but changed in some indefinable way, as if the hours and the words had done some small, visible work on the composure she had built around herself. She was looking at the table in front of her. Then she looked up, and when she spoke, her voice had something in it that had not been there when she entered the room. Not defeat exactly. Something more complicated than defeat. Something that sounded like the recognition of a distance, an enormous, unbridgeable distance, between what she believed herself to be and what the evidence in the folders described. This, she said, this is what they do when they can't win the argument. They make it personal. They find every private thing, every human imperfection, every moment of inconsistency that any real person living a real life will inevitably produce, and they use it to invalidate the larger cause. They want you to look at the hair stylist invoice and forget about the 40 million Americans without health insurance. They want you to look at my grandmother's roof and forget about the thousands of Puerto Ricans who are still waiting for disaster relief nearly a decade after Maria. They want the small thing to swallow the large thing. Kennedy let her finish. He did not interrupt. He waited until she was done, and then he waited a beat longer, the way a prosecutor waits when the closing statement of the defense has been completed and the jury is still processing it. The hairstylist, he said, is not a small thing to the hairstylist. He said it simply, without emphasis or elevation. Deja Williams, who stayed up until 2 in the morning because she wanted to do her best work, who submitted an invoice for $480, who sent emails and texts and made phone calls for 5 months, and took out a loan she could not afford to pay her own business expenses while she waited for payment from a congresswoman who earns $174,000 a year. She is not a footnote in a larger argument. She is the argument. She is the test case. She is the answer to the question of whether the rhetoric is real. He paused. You speak often about the dignity of workers, he said. You speak about the respect owed to people who provide their labor, their skill, their artistry in exchange for compensation. You speak about the accountability of those in positions of power over those in positions of economic vulnerability. And then you hire a hairstylist, receive 4 hours of her best work, and pay her 5 months late, after a formal investigation forces the issue, after she has been driven to take out a payday loan to cover the gap. He looked at her without hostility and without performance. The case against you is not made by me, he said. It is made by your own record. That is the thing about evidence. It does not require an adversary. It simply requires someone willing to read it honestly. A staffer appeared at Kennedy's elbow, leaning down to murmur something. Kennedy looked at the phone the staffer held out. He looked at it for a long moment. He nodded. The staffer withdrew. It appears, Kennedy said, with the tone of someone reading from a factual report, that the hashtag representing this hearing is currently trending nationally on multiple platforms. He did not say this with triumph. He said it with the weariness of someone who has spent a career observing the relationship between political events and digital amplification, and who finds the entire phenomenon vaguely exhausting. Ocasio-Cortez did not look at her own phone. She looked at the table. She looked at the folders. She looked at the gallery where Carmen Reyes sat with her hands folded, looking back. She looked at the reporters whose fingers had not stopped moving. She looked at the cameras. She looked at all of it, and what moved across her face in that moment was not a single identifiable emotion, but a complex, layered passage of several at once. Something that contained, if you watched carefully, something that looked like the beginning of an internal reckoning. The committee chairman, who had been largely ceremonial throughout the extraordinary 3 hours that had just elapsed, found his gavel and brought it down with the careful authority of someone reasserting a jurisdiction that had been, for the afternoon, effectively suspended. The committee will stand in recess, he said, for 30 minutes. The room did not respond to this the way rooms usually respond to recesses. There was no immediate surge of movement, no scrape of chairs and rustle of papers and burst of side conversations. People sat for a moment in the residue of what they had witnessed, the way people sit in a theater after the lights come up, needing a moment to transition from the world of the performance back to the world of the ordinary. Then slowly, the motion began. Staffers gathered papers. Reporters closed laptops. The cameras panned back from their close focus. Ocasio-Cortez gathered her materials from the witness table. She did not look at Kennedy. She did not look at the gallery. She moved toward the door with the contained, deliberate walk of someone who has decided that the manner of leaving is the only thing they can still control, and who is attending to it with everything they have. She pushed through the door. It swung closed behind her with a sound that was much quieter than the sound it had made when she entered. The difference between those two sounds contained, in its way, the entire afternoon. In his seat at the dais, Kennedy sat for a moment in the emptying room. He looked at the 4 folders arranged in their line. He looked at the empty witness table. He looked at the portraits of former committee chairs arranged along the wall, men and women from different eras and different parties who had sat in this room and conducted the business of the Republic through its various emergencies and triumphs and ordinary days, who had witnessed in this room arguments about war and peace and money, and the proper organization of the national life, who had seen people rise in this room and people fall, who had recorded in their painted eyes the peculiar dignity and peculiar squalor of democratic self-governance. He picked up his legal pad. He looked at the notes he had been taking when the door opened 3 hours ago. He flipped to a clean page. He wrote 3 words. He underlined them. He tore the page from the pad and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. His chief of staff appeared beside him. "Every outlet wants you," he said. He listed several by name. Kennedy shook his head without looking up. "Nothing tonight," he said. He began to gather the folders. "Not about this." The chief of staff nodded. He had worked for Kennedy long enough to understand that this meant something specific, that it was not false modesty or strategic restraint but a genuine conviction about the appropriate response to the afternoon. He turned to go. Kennedy stopped him. "The hair stylist," he said, "Deja Williams." He said the name carefully as if making sure he had it right. "Get me her contact information. I want to know if there is anything we can do, not publicly, just if there is something." The chief of staff wrote this down. Then he left, and Kennedy was alone in the nearly empty room with the 4 folders and the paintings and the institutional hum of a building that would be here long after all of them, processing the next argument, the next hearing, the next confrontation between what is said and what is done, between the performance and the reality, between the people who are used and the people who use them. He stood, he put on his jacket, he picked up the folders and held them under his arm. He looked at the room one more time. Outside, the evening was settling over the Capitol with the indifferent grace of a city that has hosted too much history to be impressed by any single afternoon of it. The sky was deepening into a shade of blue that belonged specifically to early evening in this latitude, a blue that was almost indigo at the edges and still bright near the horizon where the sun had recently gone. The streets were moving with the ordinary traffic of people going home from work, people on phones, people holding coffee cups, people absorbed in the enormous, consuming work of their private lives, the lives that all of this, all the hearings and the folders and the carefully documented timelines and the hashtags and the talking points, all of this was, at least in theory, supposed to be in service of. Kennedy walked through the lobby and through the door and out into that evening. He stopped for a moment on the steps. He looked at the sky. Then he looked at the folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket, the one with the 3 underlined words he had written in the nearly empty hearing room. He touched it once through the fabric of his jacket. He took his hand away. He walked to his car. In the hours and days that followed, the narrative from the hearing spread with the velocity of digital information, in an era that has mistaken speed for substance and volume for meaning. News networks ran their segments with the particular breathless energy they reserve for political confrontations that produce clean visual contrasts. The image of the blazer and the drawl, the gavel and the folders, the woman standing and the man sitting, the 4 folders arranged in their devastating line. Analysis pieces appeared with titles that made arguments from the footage without, for the most part, grappling with the content that the footage contained. In the Bronx and Queens, the coverage landed differently. In the specific communities where the specific decisions had been made and the specific consequences had been borne, people watched the hearing with the particular attention of those who recognize their own lives in a political argument. In a small apartment in Astoria, Carmen Reyes watched the portion of the hearing that featured her testimony on her phone, and then she watched it again. And then she put the phone face down on the table and sat for a while with her hands folded in her lap, thinking about her daughter who was at school, who would come home in 2 hours, who would want to talk about her day, and who had no idea that her mother had spent the afternoon in a Senate hearing room saying out loud, for the first time, what the loss of the Amazon job had actually meant. In Brooklyn, Deja Williams was in her salon, which she had kept open despite the debt and the cash flow crisis and the months of waiting for the payment, because to close it would have been to surrender the thing she had spent 7 years building, and she was not ready to do that, had not been ready to do it even when the numbers said she should. She had a client in her chair when her phone began to ring with calls from numbers she did not recognize, and then with calls from the numbers of journalists whose names she knew from the news, and then with calls from people who had seen the hearing and wanted to book appointments, and then with more calls than she could process. And she had to set the phone aside and finish the woman's hair, and then step into the back room and take a breath and decide what to do with what was happening. In Louisiana, in the office that still smelled faintly of the particular dust of a building that has been occupied by the same institution for many decades, Kennedy sat in the gathering dark. He had not turned on the lights. The evening was coming through the window in long, warm bands that crossed the floor and climbed the opposite wall, and he watched them move as the sun settled, the way he had watched them move on evenings when the work of the day had been harder or stranger or more consequential than the usual business, on evenings when what needed to happen next was not entirely clear. His phone was on the desk, and it had been ringing with the intermittent regularity of a device that has been identified as belonging to someone who is of sudden and intense interest to a large number of people. He had been not answering it for the last hour. He would answer it tomorrow. Tomorrow the calls would still be there, and the requests would still be there, and the television programs would still be there, and the articles would still be there, and all of it would still need to be navigated with the care appropriate to a situation in which a person has done something consequential and must now manage the consequences without losing sight of why they did the thing in the first place. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the folded piece of paper. He unfolded it on the desk in front of him. He looked at the 3 words he had written and underlined in the empty hearing room. The words were, "What is next?" Not as a question, precisely. As an orientation. As the thing that a person says to themselves when the immediate event is complete, and what remains is the ongoing work that the immediate event was always embedded in. The larger work that does not produce moments of clarity or confrontation, but simply continues, day after day, requiring attention and patience, and the willingness to do it even when it is not dramatic and will not trend. He picked up his pen. Below the 3 words, he wrote more words, a list, names and phone numbers and brief descriptive notes, the beginning of a set of follow-up actions, the things that needed to happen next. He wrote Carmen Reyes's name. He wrote Deja Williams's name. He wrote the name of a housing nonprofit in Queens that he had been introduced to at a conference 2 years ago and had filed away for a moment when it might be relevant. He wrote the names of 2 economists he had called that morning, whose work on economic transition programs he intended to read more carefully. He wrote a note about the predatory lending legislation he had been developing, the thing that was actually about his constituents, about the shrimp fishermen and the small business owners, and the people in Plaquemines Parish who were being destroyed by financial instruments they did not fully understand and could not afford. He wrote until the evening had become full dark, and the lights of Baton Rouge were visible through the window, the particular constellation of a mid-sized southern city settling into its night, ordinary and specific, and real in the way that things are real when they exist independently of whether anyone is paying attention to them. His phone rang one more time. He looked at the caller ID. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked it up. It was his wife. She said, "I watched some of it." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I think so." She said, "Come home." He said, "Yes." She said, "There is food." He said, "I know." She said, "John." He said, "I know." He said it again, "I know." He put the phone down. He folded the piece of paper with the words and the list and put it back in his jacket pocket. He turned off the desk lamp. He sat for a moment in the dark, in the quiet, in the space between the thing that had happened and the thing that would happen next, which was always, in the end, the space where the actual work lived. Then he stood up. He picked up his jacket. He walked out of the office and down the hall and through the lobby and out into the Louisiana night, which was warm in the way of October nights in the deep South, warm with a residual heat that the air holds long after the sun has gone, the stored memory of the day's light slowly releasing itself into the dark. He walked to his car. He got in. He drove home through streets that were ordinary and familiar and his, through the specific geography of a life that was constructed of real things, real places, real people, the kind of reality that does not trend and does not generate content and does not require a camera to be real. Back in Washington, the hearing room had been returned to its default state by the cleaning crew, whose work is the quiet epilogue to every drama that plays out in rooms like this one. The tables had been wiped. The chairs had been aligned. The water glasses had been collected and washed. The papers had been gathered or discarded. The microphones had been repositioned for the next session. The room was ready to receive whatever would come next, whatever argument or testimony or confrontation or negotiation. The machinery of governance would root through it in the days ahead. The four folders were gone. Kennedy had taken them. But on the committee table, barely visible in the residual light of the chandeliers, there was a faint mark on the polished wood where one of the folders had rested, a slight discoloration in the finish, the kind of mark that appears when something has sat in one place for a long time. It would be polished away in the next cleaning. It would disappear and leave no trace, and no one would know it had been there. But tonight it was still there. Tonight the mark was still visible. And in the gallery above the empty room, the portraits looked down at it with their painted, unchanging eyes, and they had nothing to say about it, because they had seen this before. They had always seen this before. The evidence and the arguments and the silence that follows when the arguing is done, the gap between what people say they are and what they do, the endless, irresolvable drama of people in power being asked to account for themselves. Outside, the city went on, the streets moved, the lights burned. The ordinary and extraordinary business of the Republic continued in its complex, grinding, imperfect way, producing its daily mixture of genuine service and genuine failure, of real courage and real cowardice, of people who remembered what they were elected to do, and people who forgot, of constituents who deserved better, and the question of whether they would get it. The question that is always open, always pending, always waiting to be answered, not in hearing rooms, but in the accumulation of small, unwitnessed choices made by people in positions of power on days when no one is filming. The question of who you are when no one is watching. The question of whether the thing you say and the thing you do belong to the same person. The question that every record eventually answers, in its own time and in its own way, whether you intended to answer it or not. If you believe that truth and accountability still matter, that actions must eventually align with words, and that the people who are truly being served deserve to know the difference between a champion and a performance, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this story. Because in the end, the most powerful office in this country is not a Senate seat or a House seat or any seat at any committee table. It is the attention of an informed citizen. And it is our job, the job of every person watching, to hold the record of the powerful up to the light and to read what it actually says, not what they tell us it says. That is the work. That is always the work. And it does not stop when the hearing ends.